Good evening. The Middle East crisis continues to lead the news. Thousands of American and British citizens in Kuwait were ordered to assemble under threat of being rounded up. The U.S. condemned the action. Britain called it a grave and sinister development. And Iraq's Saddam Hussein called President Bush a liar. We'll have the details in a moment. Robin?
In tonight's NewsHour, what happened in the tough talks between President Bush and Jordan's King Hussein? Then, what does Iraq intend by rounding up thousands of American and British citizens? And what options does Washington have if they're interned?
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the McNeil-era NewsHour since 1983 because quality information and quality communications is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. And by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change. And by PepsiCo. And made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Iraq today moved to round up all American and British citizens in Kuwait. Iraqi military officials issued the order in a meeting with the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait. They told him all 2,500 Americans in the country should go to a hotel, which is across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait City. They told him the Americans had 2 hours to do so and that it was to protect them from unspecified threats. A U.S. official said the Iraqis suggested they would go out and find the Americans who did not comply. State Department spokesman Richard Boucher had this reaction to the Iraqi demand.
We believe that this action is totally uncalled for. Most Americans would be better off in their homes. Of course, all would be better, all Americans, all foreigners, if they were allowed to leave, and we will continue to work towards that goal. If Americans wish to move to a hotel, that's fine. But we have instructed our charge in Baghdad to contact the Foreign Ministry immediately, to protest the action, to demand an explanation, to stress that force must not be used against Americans, and to remind the Iraqi government of its responsibility to safeguard American lives and property.
There are 4,000 British citizens in Kuwait. The British reaction to the Iraqi order came from the country's Foreign Office Minister.
There has been a development which I regard as a grave and sinister development. The Iraqi military authorities occupying Kuwait have instructed the British community, which numbers some thousands of people, men, women and children, to assemble at a hotel in Kuwait. It is clear to me that that cannot be because they believe that they are going to be, as they put it, safer in that hotel. I fear, I have no proof of this, but I fear that it is in preparation for moving those people somewhere else. I would like to express the anger of the British people if any such step is taken.
About 7,000 other foreigners did make it out of Iraq today. Most of them were Egyptians, but there were also 2 Americans, 3 Britons, and a Frenchman. There was no immediate word on how they got out. Robin?
Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, today stepped up the war of words with President Bush. Hussein's comments were in response to Mr. Bush's attack on the Iraqi leader yesterday at the Pentagon. Hussein's message was once again read by an announcer on Iraqi television and was billed as an open letter to George Bush. The Iraqi leader said, "We continue to pray that there will be no confrontation whereby you will receive thousands of Americans wrapped in sad coffins. You, President of the United States, have lied to your people. If there is a military clash, you're going to be defeated." There was a report today that an attempt had been made to kill Saddam Hussein. Egypt's state-run radio quoted travelers leaving Iraq saying many military officers and civilians had been arrested after the attempt failed. The report was denied by the Iraqi government. The president of Iran today said the new Iraqi peace offer to his country did not mean that Iran supported the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani said Iraq must get its forces out of Kuwait to re-establish peace in the region.
President Bush met with Jordan's King Hussein today. The session at Kennebunkport, Maine lasted a little more than 2 hours. There had been speculation that the king would deliver a message from Saddam Hussein. But after the meeting, he told reporters he brought no message. He was asked why Jordan was not honoring the United Nations embargo against Iraq.
The government of Jordan stated very clearly at the very outset, following the Security Council resolution, that it regarded these mandatory sanctions and measures as ones that the government of Jordan would respect, and this has been the case. So this is nothing new to talk about now.
If you are in favor of mandatory sanctions, why is food getting through the port?
We are reaching the United Nations to find out exactly what these sanctions mean. This is what the government is doing at this stage, and I believe that there are certain categories or areas where the situation is unclear, but we are adhering to these. I beg your pardon?
And you consider food to be one of those exemptions then?
This is something we're trying to clarify with the
deep regrets. Do you have any reason for hope at all, sir?
I suppose one has to have hope. Without hope, you can't get anywhere. And the dangers are such that it's unthinkable to contemplate the idea of giving up and not trying one's best to resolve this problem to the satisfaction of all and hopefully for a better future.
So, Your Majesty, you acknowledge that there are some shipments now passing through the port of Aqaba?
There are no shipments at the moment, as far as I know, no.
Might you close that port altogether, sir?
It's our only outlet to the sea, and it's our only outlet to the sea and to the rest of the world, and it's what our port. We receive everything that we import into Jordan. We export a lot of our own phosphates and other things.
Shipments to Iraq or from Iraq?
What?
Might you close the port to Iraqi commerce?
Sir, this is a question of detail. The government is dealing with it. I told you that we are adhering to this UN Security Council sanctions, and we regret very much indeed that the situation has happened today.
You said that the president has you said you have a better understanding now of what the president's viewpoint is. Did you express your viewpoint? Did you ask for any understanding about the kind of economic situation, political situation you're in? And what did...
Very frankly and honestly, we are passing through a very difficult economic and situation in Jordan, and we are affected probably much more than any in this regard. But this, as I expressed to the President before I arrived here, was the least of my worries at the moment. I was concerned with the problem that all of us are worried about, both in my part of the world and here, and everywhere in the world, and that is what I wanted to talk about, and I have done.
Later in the afternoon, President Bush met with reporters there in Kennebunkport. He commented on his meeting with King Hussein and today's other developments in the crisis.
We've had some good meetings here today. Two good meetings, one with King Hussein of Jordan, the other with the Foreign Minister, His Highness Prince Saud of Saudi Arabia. In addition, I was on the phone earlier to President Özal of Turkey. He reported in on some conversations he's had, and I must say was somewhat optimistic about the effectiveness of these international sanctions in which most countries around the world have joined. And so it's been a very illuminating day. I, of course, was very pleased that King Hussein, who previously had announced his support for sanctions, his willingness to go with sanctions, reiterated that to me, making clear that this was a decision that Jordan had taken some time ago. But nevertheless, I put this under the heading of very encouraging developments. And in terms of the Saudis, Prince Saud very kindly thanked me for the strong support from the United States, and I told him that we were determined and wanted to do everything in our power to enforce the United Nations resolution, which calls for Iraq to get out of Kuwait, and the rest calls for the restoration of the rulers to Kuwait. So we're in sync with the Saudis. I feel that the differences that possibly existed with Jordan have been narrowed, and I cited one extremely important point there, but I was pleased to see them both here at our home, and I'll be glad to take some questions. Yeah, Terry, and then Jim.
Mr. President, what kind of report did King Hussein give you on his trip to Baghdad? Did he offer any kind of hope that Saddam Hussein would pull his troops out of Kuwait and let the emir return to power?
He didn't go into any details of his trip to Baghdad, and I did not come away from that conversation with a feeling of hope that Saddam Hussein would do that which he's been called upon to do by under international law.
Mr. President, what can you tell us about reports, or what do you know about reports that foreign nationals in both Iraq and Kuwait have been ordered segregated and been reported to report to one place, including some 2,500 Americans? Are you concerned that their lives may be in danger at this point?
I'm concerned that any coercion on foreign nationals in some other country is a violation of international norms. And I must say that I did see a report. We've discussed it. They checked with one of the hotels to which people were encouraged to go, and the hotel had no knowledge of an influx of people coming there. So it's a little vague right now, Jim, but anything that compels individuals to do something against their will would, of course, concern me. And I don't want to overstate it, because we continue to get statements out of these various representatives of Iraq, the ambassador to the UN, for example, and that these people will, in all countries, will be permitted free passage or will not be harassed. But I saw the report, and thus I must say I was concerned. Yeah.
Following up on that, the Americans who are in Baghdad, I believe, are the ones who were taken from Kuwait, and today the American embassy personnel were for the first time not allowed to go in and see them, and news people were thrown out. Isn't it getting more dangerous for those Americans, and would there be anything that would...
It's more dangerous, I think, if I heighten the concern that I've already expressed. And I said that the other day, and I'll repeat it here. On the other hand, when you get reports of this nature, of course you're concerned about them.
Mr. President, may I ask your reaction to the rather bellicose speech we heard today from Saddam Hussein, in which, as you probably know, he called you a liar and vowed to send Americans home in body bags?
Well, I really haven't seen the speech. I've seen some excerpts, or the open letter, I think it was, and I think it's clear that what we need to do at this point is to enforce the international law. The statements that the United Nations from many countries really say it all, and so there's no point in me responding to the letter. I didn't see any, or nobody's at least presented so far to me from that letter any concrete proposals to which I feel a necessity to respond. Yeah.
Mr. President, what is the situation on the ground in Iraq and Kuwait? What's going on with the sanctions? How are they working today compared to how they were working 2 days ago, say?
The sanctions against Iraq and Kuwait, I get the feeling that the sanctions just put into effect and just being put into effect are beginning to take hold. And I would cite a very upbeat statement from President Özal of Turkey in this regard. And so there doesn't appear to be any shipments of oil coming out of Iraq. And that is very positive, because I think 90% of their foreign exchange, I'm looking for help here, is based on petroleum. And so I'd say that is a very encouraging step. And the other part of it has to be arms being interdicted, and everything, all across the board, foodstuffs, whatever it is. They have been penalized by the United Nations. Chapter 7 is seldom used, but it has been used now to call these people, to bring these people to do what's right. And I must say I'm encouraged with this concept of the world staying together and making these sanctions fully effective.
There were wire service reports today that 45,000 U.S. Marines would be sent to the Persian Gulf. They will supplement the 60,000 Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel already there. Also, an administration source was quoted saying President Bush authorized naval commanders to use the minimum force necessary to stop ships from delivering goods to or from Iraq. U.S. Air Force officers in the Middle East today told reporters about some encounters between U.S. and Iraqi fighter pilots. They said on several occasions the radar used to aim the American weapons locked onto the Iraqi planes. They said when the Iraqi pilots realized it, they flew away.
Now, more detail on what happened at Kennebunkport to make King Hussein and American officials look so grim when they came out after 2 hours of talks. We're joined in Kennebunkport by Karen Hosler, White House correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. In Washington by Hisham Melem, Washington correspondent for the Lebanese newspaper As-Safir, and Bruce Van Voorst, senior national security affairs correspondent of Time magazine. In Kennebunkport, Karen Hosler, is it just our imagination, or was there a difference in tone between the way the Jordanians looked at it and the way the President Bush did?
Well, I think the president was being as optimistic as possible, somewhat unrealistically so, you might say, listening to the King's statements. The U.S. officials said they had no expectations going into this meeting, but they'd made clear to us in advance that the president was going to be pushing Hussein to abide by the UN sanctions, because there's been evidence, as you know, that cargo supplies have been going through the port of Aqaba to Iraq. The King, however, came out of the meeting today saying that he was still trying to clarify whether the UN sanctions actually applied to food. Well, that's a very large loophole, and one that the United States is very anxious to have closed. So it was not a successful meeting. You might even say a failure from the standpoint of both the White House and King Hussein.
I guess what it means, am I right in thinking, it means that Jordan, at least, is not accepting the authority of the U.S.-led blockade and is still deferring to the technicality of the United Nations resolutions.
Well, that's certainly true. The King, Jim Baker later explained to reporters that what the King was trying to do was to clarify the exemption to the UN sanctions that applies to food for humanitarian purposes. Well, the United States has already said that we don't consider the situation dire enough to exempt food for humanitarian purposes. In fact, the president told us today that he learned from President Özal of Turkey that all they're doing so far is telling bakers not to make sweets. So it's not really pinching that badly, and the U.S. believes that food should be exempted, and you could see that the King is looking for a way out through the UN sanctions.
If President Bush said possible differences were narrowed, did American briefers give any indication of in what way differences between the U.S. and Jordan were narrowed?
Well, no. As a matter of fact, the meetings just occurred, and the briefers have not been back to talk to the press corps. But from what we learned earlier, there just seemed to be a discrepancy between the reading of how important Jordan was, how much Jordan was relying on the exemption for food. So the president was just more optimistic than the King.
There's an interesting sidelight. Lloyd's Shipping Intelligence reports from London that Jordanian port authorities in Aqaba had forced a Cypriot freighter to unload 1,000 tons of sugar destined for Iraq when the ship's managers, the Cypriots, had been resisting pressure to unload the cargo since it was forcibly taken into Aqaba. Hisham Melem, do you regard the meeting with King Hussein as a failure today?
Clearly, the meeting did not produce any political breakthrough, and I don't think the King or the American side expected political breakthroughs. However, the meeting did improve the atmosphere between the President and the King. But on the question of fundamentals, the gap remains wide.
What are the fundamentals that
questions
remain
of principles.
wide?
The King still believes that the American deployment in Saudi Arabia is a mistake, unnecessary escalation. The King, on the question of sanctions, cannot and will not cannot and will not starve the Iraqi people. It's one thing to have sanctions against contraband and weapons and what have you, but on the question of foodstuff, he cannot willingly abide by the...
So are you assuming from your information that the king put those points fairly forcefully to President Bush today, that he did think that the deployment in Saudi Arabia, the military deployment, was a mistake?
Absolutely. This has been his position, and he reiterated it today. I think also the king was very concerned about the verbal escalation between the President Bush and President Saddam Hussein of Iraq. And he used the chance today to explain his predicament, the competing pressures that Jordan is subjected to. We hear reports about pressure from Saudi Arabia. We hear reports from growing pressure from his own population. He knows that his population is decidedly with Iraq. And if he's going to be forced to abide by the United Nations, he would like to make that very clear to his own population as well as to the Iraqis that I'm going to be abiding by clear-cut UN mandate. And
not the orders of the United States, you mean?
Absolutely. I mean, in the end, maybe a U.S. blockade will be acceptable because at least he could say, I did my best. It's beyond my control at this stage.
I see. From what you said about his concern about the escalating rhetoric, would you think that he, in a diplomatic way, criticized President Bush for the strength of the things President Bush said yesterday?
I think so. This is what was hinted to me this afternoon. I think the king's mission was not made easier by yesterday's strong position by President Bush and today's rebuttal by Saddam Hussein of Iraq. I think he knows that this verbal duel can only lead to miscalculation on both sides. And I think the Jordanians know, and they were saying this, the Jordanian knows that such a verbal duel was rich with ironies and self-righteousness and deception, although they would admit it privately by both sides. Here you have the President of the United States posing as a defender of Islam and the Arab nation, questioning Saddam Hussein's Islamic and Arab credentials, criticizing him for initiating the war against Iran, and conveniently forgetting that the United States did support him during those 8 years of war against Iran. On the other hand, obviously, the Jordanians are admitting that Saddam Hussein is making the king's mission impossible by resorting to also belligerent rhetoric. Here you have Saddam Hussein also at one time wearing his secular hat, at another time he's wearing his turban, being as atavistic as your next door mullah. So he is between a rock and a hard place.
Karen Hostler, any reflection of that tough talking from the king in the reaction of the American officials there?
Well, as I said, that we have the president himself gave his own sort of readout, as they say up here, and he came out, as you said, saying that they narrowed the differences, that it was an optimistic session, that he felt good and upbeat about it. Though we know from what American officials were saying during the day that this has really been a day of deepening crisis. They're very concerned about the other developments going on over there, the Americans being held and so forth. So the mood here is glum, and the King's visit did not improve it at all.
Okay, Bruce Van Voorst, is the mood glum at the Pentagon today? I mean, is the feeling of deepening crisis felt there?
Well, certainly the activity of the Pentagon is incredible. The size of the deployment that we're seeing taking place grows every day, and again today the Pentagon announced the mobilization and dispatch of yet another group, the 3rd Cavalry in Fort Bliss, Texas. Again, a heavy unit, and a unit which will play a big role in whatever armored confrontation might take place in the area. There is also, there is upcoming shortly, it appears, a decision on the calling up of reserves. We touched on that yesterday, but it appears consistent with the total force concept, which has been a part of the Army doctrine and the service doctrine for many years now. The Pentagon is reaching the place now with the deployment where it's necessary to call up additional forces. Now, there are a lot of people willing to volunteer for certain reserve slots, but the president now has, under new legislation, the authority to call up to 200,000 troops for specific, from the reserve forces.
And are you saying that decision has been made or is imminent?
I think that decision is very imminent. I should emphasize it will be just for specific categories. Each of the services has to decide what special work capabilities and MOs, as they call them in the military, they need.
Are you getting the impression, I know you told us yesterday that these deployments are based on contingency plans that have been around for a long time, but are you getting the impression, also referring to the report that 45,000 Marines may be sent, that they're now discovering, as 2 weeks after the invasion of Kuwait, that they're getting in deeper than they thought they would have to?
The question has finally emerged after this far into the crisis whether, in fact, that defensive posture which they began with is now gradually emerging into an offensive capability. These contingency plans we mentioned do provide for various stages of mobilization, and not all are triggered by the first push of the button. However, it's clear that under presidential orders, the Pentagon is determined to establish a very, very significant presence in the area, not only on the ground, but with Air Force capability and with a large naval armada around. And that continues to grow, and I suspect that we're going to see, even in the days to come, further announcements of dispatch of troops. But we have to make one point clear. In many cases, these troops are going by ship, and so they will not be on scene for 30, 40, or even 50 days.
I see. From where you sit tonight, would you say the people you talk to have a more pessimistic expectation that there's actually going to be some fighting before this is over, or what? Or am I wrong about that?
I think as the days continue, the realization continues that we are in a very dicey situation. Today we heard reports of aircraft locking on radars to Iraqi aircraft, and when you get into a situation like that where you have your weapons radar targeted on another aircraft and ready to fire, accidents can happen, and it would be terrible if there were an accidental exchange of fire, because certainly we would be fired back upon at that point.
All right. Well, thank you, Bruce. Jim?
Now to some analysis of the day's events, particularly the potential roundup of the 2,500 Americans and 4,000 British citizens stranded in Kuwait. Richard Helms is the former Director of Central Intelligence and a former U.S. Ambassador to Iran. William Odom is a retired Army Lieutenant General who headed the National Security Agency. He was on the National Security Council staff from 1977 to 81 and was military liaison during the Iran hostage rescue attempt. Gary Sick was a member of the National Security Council staff in the Carter administration. General John Wickham was Army Chief of Staff from 1983 to 87. Karen Elliott House is a veteran diplomatic correspondent and former foreign editor of the Wall Street Journal, who recently interviewed Saddam Hussein. She's now a vice president of the Dow Jones Publishing Company. She joins us tonight from Denver. Ambassador Helms, 2,500 Americans, 4,000 Britons in Kuwait. The orders today, the British government calls it a grave and sinister situation. Would you agree?
Well, I don't quite agree. It seems to me that what the Iraqis are doing is that they can read the papers too, and they see a lot of foreigners are escaping across the border into Saudi Arabia and Jordan. It may be that they're rounding up these foreigners so they can put them in one place and keep them there and guard them and have less of a headache with them. It could easily be that. Also, they could be moving them to Baghdad. But the fact that they are rounding them up doesn't seem to me to be particularly sinister one way or the other.
General Wickham?
I wouldn't want to impute any unsinister objectives to the Iraqis. Unsinister. I think that this is uncalled for. There's been no act of aggression. There's no war there. And the proper thing to do would be to let these citizens leave a potential area of instability. I think this is an ominous portent for us, what they are doing with these citizens.
Ominous portent, General Odom?
I agree with that. I think this is a very bad situation. I don't think it's clarified yet. I'm not sure how it's likely to emerge, but the logic is clearly towards something that's the functional equivalent of a hostage situation.
You agree, Gary Sick, that a hostage situation, you smell a hostage situation coming?
I don't smell it coming. I think we've got it. I think we're toying with words, and in Saddam Hussein's case, one should, I suppose, hope for the best, but expect the worst. If he wanted to let these people go, he's had plenty of opportunity. He already promised a few days ago that he was going to let them all go. Nothing has happened. And there was a threat implied in this statement about collecting people together. I think that this is one of the levers that he has to play. I think he's surprised at the reaction that he got from the world community, and that this is one of the ways he has to respond to it and perhaps act to either deter action or perhaps to goad the West into rethinking its position.
Karen Elliott House, how do you read it? Do you read into it the worst?
I think, as someone has already said, one can hope for the best and expect the worst. I think Saddam Hussein now has two strategies. One, to play for time, and two, to frighten us out of action, and that this collection of people is a part of both of those.
Ambassador Helms, let's say you're wrong. Let's say that everybody else is right here in this discussion, and that call it Gary Sick says it's already a hostage situation. General Wickham, I think, would agree, and General Odom, that these people are already being held against their will.
I think it's been a hostage situation since day one. I mean, when the international community is bringing all this pressure to bear on Saddam Hussein, he has very few options left him. And one of them is to hold on to all these foreigners, Russians, Americans, British, whatever they may be. And I don't think he has the slightest intention of letting them escape across the border. And I think that's the reason he's bringing them together. I did not mean to imply that this was fun and games, that he was giving them a tea party or anything of that kind. But I do want to entertain the thought, anyway, that this is a lever and a pawn that he is going to use. And it's a powerful one, because there's very little we can do about it.
Because that was the question I was going to ask you. What do we do about this? Let's say that these people are rounded up, interred, to use the word, interned, taken to Baghdad or whatever. What in the world do we do about it?
Nothing useful. I mean, we had 444 hostages in Tehran. I mean, we had 444 days of hostages in Tehran, and we couldn't do anything about that. Even the desert operation didn't work. What do we do? 2,500 people? You'd have to have a ship to take them out of there. Now, what kind of a military operation could you possibly mount without going to war with Iraq? Now, maybe we're prepared to go to war with Iraq to do this, but I doubt it.
So, but do you agree, General Wickham, the only way to get those people out of there is to go to war?
Not necessarily. We're up against a very tough guy, street fighter, Saddam, and that's emerging. I think what he has done with Iran is defang the Iranian situation so he can move assets down to the area near Saudi Arabia and to keep Iran off of his back. I think, as Ambassador has indicated, that these hostages already are hostages. He is using those for the ultimate bargaining activity. If hostilities do break out, and I don't think they will, but it's conceivable, if they do break out, these could be very valuable for bargaining. They could be very valuable in terms of putting them around on military bases that he would like to protect from attack and try to deter us from attacking them by saying, wait a minute, there are hostages in these bases.
And if you attack them, you kill your own people.
You might kill your own. Now,
is he the kind of man who would do that?
Oh, use gas against Kurds that are part of his own nation, and he's used gas and other capabilities. He has the long-range capabilities to do this. Now, the idea of trying to free that many hostages is a very, very complicated military undertaking. We'd know where they would be. And as the ambassador indicated, we were unable even to go in and pick up the 100 or so that were in Iran. We've not been very successful in taking hostages out of other sands.
So he has us, General Odom, is that right? If he wants to keep those people, he's got them.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with what's been said about the technical difficulties in a rescue mission. I think it's wholly infeasible. And I don't think that we'll see the hostages or these Americans or either other foreign nationals released until this whole situation comes to some sort of settlement.
Well, what would you say to the man in the street who would say, well, now, wait a minute. Why can't the President of the United States, directly or indirectly, get a message to Saddam Hussein which says, you harm a hair on the head of an American and we will destroy Baghdad, or we will wipe out your oil fields, or we will do something? Is it played that way? Could this be played that way?
Well, I can understand why an American citizen would feel that way about it. But I think anyone who understands what Saddam Hussein has lived through and what he's forced Iraqis to live through in 8 or so years of war with Iran understands that he could withstand that kind of punishment, or he certainly would not be willing to surrender to that kind of intimidation.
Karen Elliott House, you interviewed Saddam Hussein, you know him. How do you think he would react to that kind of tough talk, threat, whatever you want to call it?
Just as General Odom said, I think the one thing that we can do about the hostage problem is, and I'm sorry to say this because I know it will sound cruel, is ignore it. It is the only thing we can do about it. What he hopes to do is paralyze this country the way it was paralyzed during the Iranian hostage crisis, with we cannot go forward, we can't focus on anything except these 2,500 people, and surely we won't let that happen.
But how do we ignore 2,500 people, Karen? How does the President of the United States, the Congress...
What about 200 million Americans?
Yeah.
I mean, we went into this situation, if we have any reason to be there at all, we're there, as the President said yesterday, to protect our way of life. I mean, this is an economic issue. If Saddam Hussein is able to control the production and pricing of oil out of Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, he has an economic stranglehold, which he may or may not choose to use, but certainly could use over the next however long he's in power. And that's the reason, in my view, we're there. It's nice that we're there to protect territorial integrity and all of those other high-sounding aims, but we're fundamentally there to protect global economic interests, of which ours are one.
Gary Sick is, excuse me, General Wicker, I just wanted to ask Gary Sick a question. Is that really what it boils down to? The choice for the President and for the United States generally is we either ignore these people or we go to war? In other words, we ignore the fact that they're being held, if that in fact is what it turns out to be, or we go to war?
I believe I'm a little bit more optimistic than some of my colleagues in this discussion, in the sense that Saddam Hussein is a very tough guy. Let's remember back at the beginning of before the Iran-Iraq War began, and Iran was flirting around with terrorism inside Iraq. Saddam Hussein arrested a senior Shia cleric and put him in jail as a warning, and when Iran ignored that warning, killed him, and killed his sister along with him, causing a great stir in Shia religious circles. This is a man who had nothing to do with Iran's policy even. So this is a brutal, tough man. But he is a man who understands his own interests. And I think it's a mistake to assume that he doesn't respond to any kind of logic, that he never responds to a threat. I would argue in this case that this hostage situation can only get worse. That if, in fact, they bring them all together and, as General Wickham suggested, move them around to bases all over the country where they are, in effect, held as deterrent points, things are going to be even worse than they are now. International law says that he should not be able to do that. He should not be able to move it, and it seems to me that at this point our policy should be insist on obedience to international law. Maybe he won't go along with that, but it seems to me we could send a very private message. That's your public policy. But behind the scenes, I think we should deliver a very tough message. And for instance, King Hussein is here in the country right now. He's a very close friend of Saddam Hussein, a personal friend and a political ally. And it seems to me that this would be a very good thing to whisper in the king's ear and have him take back with him some very clear ideas of how we will respond if international law is ignored and if those hostages are either moved and held in detention or harmed in any way. And I think Saddam, when push comes to shove, as it has, for instance, with his current situation with Iran, he has just, in effect, admitted that he lost the Iran-Iraq War in order to free up his forces on that front. That's quite a concession. If he will give in that kind of concessions under pressure, there are other things that can be done under pressure as well, and I think now is the time to address it.
What do you think of that, Ambassador Helms?
No, I think that it's true what Gary Sick says, that he has conceded to Iran what the war was fought about. But this is a very smart move on his part, because one mustn't forget that Iran is run by a Shia clergyman, I mean, clerics, mullahs. And what he is doing is opening the border so that Iranian pilgrims can now go to the two holiest places of the Shiite sect of Islam in Najaf and Karbala. He's going to make it possible now for an exchange of prisoners of war, which the Iranians have desperately wanted back from him. He and Iran have the same interest when it comes to the price of oil. They want it up. And they are joined on another parallel interest, which is they both hate the ruling family of Saudi Arabia. And so I have an idea that under the covers, without too much fanfare and so forth, you're going to see a leaky border between Iran and Iraq, and that is going to be an advantage to Saddam because that's a long littoral on the east coast of the Persian Gulf, which belongs to Iran, and which therefore may become open to him.
But you wouldn't read it then the way Gary Sick reads it, that you could, if you wanted to, read some flexibility in this man, Saddam Hussein, that it's possible, Gary Sick's specific thing, that you could get a tough message to Saddam Hussein, and he just might react better than some of us might think he might react.
Well, I think that's right, because he's an intelligent man, obviously, and a shrewd man. But I don't agree with Gary that King Hussein is going to take some message back that we're going to bomb Saddam Hussein back to the Middle Ages.
General Wickham, what do you think about that kind of message?
I think he's got that message. President Bush made it clear, even in the earlier segment here up in Kennebunkport, that uppermost in his mind is the safety and security of American citizens and other citizens that may be incarcerated with them. That message goes fundamentally to Saddam and his cohorts there. I disagree with Karen that we ought to ignore the hostage issue. She is right in the sense that the hostage issue should not drive our whole policy. Our whole policy ought to be driven by the interests of the allied nations that are trying to deter hostilities there. We ought to proceed apace with the buildup of forces, proceed apace with the development of a joint embargo capability in accordance with the UN resolution. And that will, in turn, help us solve the hostage issue, not to make the hostage issue the driver.
General Odom, do you agree with Gary Sick, though, that whatever, if we're going to do something, we ought to do it quickly, because once this thing, let's say it does become a real hostage situation, and these people are all gathered together somewhere, then it becomes a very long, drawn-out deal. If there's anything we can do, we ought to do it now.
The trouble I have with Gary's analysis and the trouble I have with some of this other analysis is that I'm not sure precisely what it is we're going to do that's going to frighten Saddam Hussein so much. Let me point out that the military realities are not yet in our favor out there. And while we might be able to bomb Baghdad, or we might be able to destroy oil facilities, or do things like that in the short term, that will not destroy over a dozen, maybe 20 armored divisions, which he has. And those divisions are quite capable of overrunning Saudi Arabia. So the military balance is not nearly as much in our favor yet. Bruce Van Voorst made the point that we're announcing movements out there every day. I don't think we ought to lose sight of the fact that announcing their departure is the same as their arrival and the development of defensive positions. Therefore, it's not clear to me that there's much you can threaten him with at the moment. Furthermore, I would like to underscore what Karen House said about forgetting them. I lived through that in the Carter White House. I saw it again in the Reagan administration. And I think it is very debilitating to the president's ability to manage policy when the focus becomes excessively on the hostages. I know that's extremely difficult advice to follow. I doubt that we'll be able to do it, particularly when one thinks about the families involved. But if one were to sit back coolly and look at it in our larger interest, I think she's exactly right.
Let's bring the reporters back into this. First, Mr. Mellom, what's your reading of Saddam Hussein? How would he react? First of all, do you think he's capable, and do you believe a hostage situation is either already there or is in the making, and that this man is going to use those Americans and those Britons to his purposes?
Potentially, we have a hostage situation there. Clearly, his options are diminishing, and I think he would use them as a deterrence against an American attack. He is very concerned about that possibility, and I think his foreign minister and he himself are alluding to that. the sense I'm getting from the discussion here and from the atmosphere in Washington is that armed clashes are almost inevitable. And I think when the United States dispatch stealth bombers and assault units, and then the president talks openly about the fact that there's no way for a political settlement in the near future, we are making a very nervous man even more dangerous. Admittedly, he can be unpredictable and he can be ruthless, and he proved that time and again. However, I agree with Gary Sick that the man has been with us for almost 20 years, and he has a track record. He backed down in 1975. He backed down in 1982, in July of 1982, when the Iranians pushed him from Iranian territory back to Iraqi territory, and then he said he came up with an initiative to end the war. Again, yesterday he came up with another initiative in which I agree with Gary again. He admitted that he lost the war. In fact, that he fought 8 years war with Iran in vain. There may still be a narrow opportunity for a political settlement. The question that I would pose is, do we want another Lebanon in Iraq? Do we want another Beirut in Baghdad? And let's keep in mind, this is Iraq, not Lebanon. You can contain things in Lebanon. Here you have, for the first time, a situation in which all major Arab countries, with the exception of Algeria, are involved in a volatile, explosive situation. You have a military conflagration. You have a tragic encounter between Arabs and Americans in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. And as one commentator in the region said, the gates of hell will open, and then they will devour the whole political, economic structure in the region, order in the region, from Egypt to Oman on the peninsula. It's a very dangerous situation, and I think we shouldn't play into his hand. If Saddam Hussein has a death wish, let him do it individually. We shouldn't allow him to drag Iraq and the rest of the Arab world, for that matter, and the American interest in the region with him.
Yeah. Karen Hostler up at Kennebunkport, is there talk of this kind of serious move against Saddam Hussein if, in fact, these people are being held hostage, or it turns out that is the decision? Is the president prepared to move, or what is he prepared to do? Is he prepared to ignore them, or are the discussions even underway?
Well, it's impossible to know exactly all of the discussions underway, but my reading on it is that the president is taking the position that Karen House recommended, essentially, that he is trying to put a very low profile, as he said earlier today, on the Americans over there. He said he thinks it will increase the danger to them if he stresses his concerns. So my reading of it, from talking to people here, is that President Bush is going to go ahead with what he thinks is the right way to handle this situation, regardless of the Americans who are over there, in the name of the larger purpose of stopping Saddam Hussein and protecting, and let's face it, American oil and our economic interests.
Is there some kind of feeling there, though, about whether or not President Bush would, in fact, threaten Saddam Hussein? You hurt those Americans, or you move those Americans, or you whatever, I will order the following military moves?
I don't think that President Bush operates that way. He's, as you know, very experienced in foreign policy. He's been around for many years. I would think that he would put it much more subtly than that, because he knows he's dealing with an unpredictable and ruthless character. The administration is, I believe, a little embarrassed, perhaps a lot embarrassed, that they underestimated Saddam Hussein in recent weeks, did not expect him to invade, so they're taking great care with him now. And I'm sure that he told King Hussein, gave him some words to be passed on, but I would doubt very seriously whether he made an inflammatory threat that would set off this bomb.
Bruce Van Voorst, you heard what General Odom said, that we need to keep in mind as well that if then there's going to be any military threats that we're not prepared to really do, we've got to remember what our resources are. You agree with that? And is the American military, the Defense Department, aware of that?
Well, yes, of course, and that's why they continue the buildup. However, there's a question of just how much military strength and how many forces are necessary in the area to do a defensive job, and at what point this capability becomes offensive as well. There's a point, though, there's a leitmotif to what to our conversation here, which I really think deserves to be emphasized, and that is that the question of do we understand the psyche and the attitudes and all the historical background of the people that we're dealing with. I found the most devastating thing of the day the fact that President Bush said that he didn't interrogate King Hussein on Saddam Hussein. Seems to me the first thing he'd have done is set him down and say, now what did he say? And this White House crew is not exactly studded with Middle East experts. And here you have King Hussein, who, as was pointed out, sometimes wears a Paris-tailored suit, sometimes wears a keffiyeh. And I like to hear from him in his keffiyeh status sometime. And I just think that it's terribly important now, rather than judging that we have a successful or unsuccessful meeting with him, to try to understand what King Hussein is trying to tell us about the dynamics of the area. Gary Sick, do you agree that that's the key to this, is to try to understand this man?
You know, I really don't think this is a subtle situation. And I don't think that it requires a lot of intricate policy understandings. This, unfortunately, is politics being played out at the level of the bully on the schoolyard. It's really that simple, basically. And that is often a very unpleasant situation. Confronting a bully, taking your risks, perhaps taking some hits, may be necessary. But that is the way you deal with it. I do agree that low profile is the correct approach, but that's your public approach. In private, you act a very different way and you let it be known. With regard to the balance of forces over there, there are 30 more divisions on the way. And no matter how much we put into it, we're not going to be able to match that force on the ground. So the balance of forces is not going to change in our favor.
Karen Elliott House, you heard what Mr. Mellom said, that let's don't help Saddam Hussein destroy the Arab world and America. Let's let him do it to himself. How do you read what he's saying? How do you react to that? Is he right?
I think the U.S. has to be very careful not to come across as the defender of the Saudi royal family and the Emir of Kuwait and his family, but it's an unfortunate situation, as Gary just said, that we don't have pleasant options if we want to protect our interests. I think the Arab world is going to grow increasingly unhappy with our presence, but what do we do? I mean, I don't know how you let Saddam Hussein hang himself. If you turn around and leave, he's the winner. So I don't see an option until he is ready to yield a bit. And I would agree with Gary that it is not impossible for Saddam Hussein to back down. I do not think he'll back down quickly. We're going to have to be prepared to stand firm for a whole lot longer. And I would argue, unfortunately, that time is probably on Saddam Hussein's side, that we're going to get tired of this confrontation before he is.
You agree, Mr. Mellom, that time is on Saddam Hussein's side?
In the immediate future, yes. I mean, if he can buy himself a stalemate, obviously. Already I talked to my friends in Cairo, for instance, and they were telling me that all those who are denouncing Saddam Hussein, and that includes not only the government, but people in the opposition, among the intelligentsia, are also very harsh in their reaction about the American deployment in Saudi Arabia, and they don't want Egypt to be seen as providing the fig leaf for an American presence there.
How would they react to Saddam Hussein holding 2,500 Americans and 4,000 British citizens hostage?
I mean, they will denounce him, but then they will say, look, this man did the same thing and worse to his own people, to his own clan, if you will.
Yeah.
Nobody will be surprised if he reaches that point. The thing that they would stress is that why did the United States play into his hand? I think with proper sanctions, I don't really believe that the Iranians are going to come to the rescue. Let's keep in mind that Iran sees itself as the dominant power in the Gulf, and it's not going to allow Iraq to get away with the taking over Kuwait. They may agree on oil, they may agree on opposing the American presence there, they may dislike the Saudi royal family and all the dynasties there, but it doesn't mean that Iran's going to rescue him. And I don't expect 30 divisions to come to the Kuwaiti border. I mean, they're not going to be that useful.
All right, we have to leave it there. Both of you Karens and all of you gentlemen, thank you very much.
In other news today, the Environmental Protection Agency said 119 cities failed to meet federal air quality standards in the last 3 years. Los Angeles came first on both lists, the too much smog and carbon monoxide lists. Last year, 124 cities were cited. Consumer prices rose 0.4% in July. The annual inflation rate is now running at 5.8%, nearly a full point higher than last year. Housing starts fell to the lowest level in 8 years. They were down 2.6% in July. In South Africa, black factional fighting spread to the township of Soweto. At least 9 people were killed and 100 wounded when men armed with axes and spears attacked passengers at a railway station. We have a report from South Africa by Mike Hanna of Independent Television News.
The township that's always symbolized United's black resistance today became divided. The intertribal warfare that swept through areas east and west of Johannesburg erupted in Soweto as Zulu clashed with Xhosa. But again underlying the conflict is a political battle between the Zulu-based Inkatha movement and the African National Congress. This lone body just part of the cost. And despite the pleas of ANC and Inkatha leaders, the violence continued throughout the day, their supporters making clear they wanted revenge rather than peace. And the role of the police was once again a source of dispute. While senior officers insisted all was being done to keep the warring sides apart, ANC leaders were adamant that the police were partisan, arguing that the bulk of their action was directed at ANC rather than Inkatha followers.
We came here to gather them to speak to them, and your men appear from this side and just here against them.
The role of the police was discussed at a surprise meeting between President de Klerk and Nelson Mandela this morning, as were other aspects of the violence, in particular the threat it poses to the ongoing peace negotiations.
After that meeting, the ANC issued a statement calling for blacks to unite and to end the fighting. In Moscow, President Gorbachev restored the citizenship of exiled writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn and 22 others. Solzhenitsyn was charged with treason in 1974. Gorbachev apologized for 2 decades of political repression.
Once again, to recap the latest developments in the Middle East crisis, Iraq ordered all American and British citizens in Kuwait to assemble under threat of a military roundup. The U.S. condemned the action. Britain called it a grave and sinister development. Saddam Hussein stepped up his war of words, calling President Bush a liar and saying the U.S. troops would go home in coffins if they attacked. Pentagon officials said 45,000 Marines will join 60,000 other American military personnel in the Persian Gulf area. Jordan's King Hussein met with President Bush in Kennebunkport on enforcing the embargo on trade with Iraq. The king said he is seeking clarification from the United Nations. President Bush later said he'd been assured Jordan would comply. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the News Hour tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night with a look at how American public and press opinion is reacting to the crisis in the Middle East. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by PepsiCo.
Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo.
And by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change. And by AT&T. And made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This is PBS.